Some killers use force, some use fear, and some don't need either. In the summer of 1990, women across Seattle met a man who seemed calm, polite, trustworthy. He knew how to speak softly, how to smile just enough to lower your guard. They called him the Charmer. But behind that charm was something ritualistic, something cruel. When the first body was found, it wasn't just murder. It was a message, a body carefully posed, a scene deliberately staged. Then it happened again, and again. 3 women, 3 crime scenes, each more disturbing than the last. This wasn't random violence. This was control. This is UNSAID Case Files. And this is the story of George Russell, the killer who didn't look dangerous until it was far too late. George Waterfield Russell Jr. was born in April of 1958 in Florida. Almost immediately, his life was marked by instability. His parents separated while he was still an infant. His mother eventually moved him across the country to Mercer Island, Washington, where she remarried. But instead of finding structure, George found distance. By the time he was 16, George was living with his stepfather, a relationship that quickly became tense and unsettling. During this period, Russell developed an inappropriate fascination with his stepmother. He watched her. He spied on her. When his behavior was discovered, he was kicked out of the house. From there, George drifted between relatives, living with aunts, never settling, never forming secure attachments. It was during these years that his boundaries, already weak, began to disappear entirely. Trouble followed him. Throughout his teenage years and into early adulthood, Russell repeatedly came into contact with law enforcement. The crimes were mostly small at first: truancy, theft, burglaries, but they formed a pattern. Rules didn't apply to him. Consequences were something to be avoided, not feared. In 1971, Russell was caught skipping school. Instead of punishment, he was given an unusual opportunity. He was allowed to work at the Mercer Island police station. For most teenagers, that might have been a turning point. For George Russell, it became a lesson. He learned how officers spoke, how they carried themselves, how authority sounded. He learned that a uniform, or even the suggestion of one, could disarm suspicion. Years later, women would say they felt comfortable around him, that he seemed responsible, trustworthy. They didn't know where that confidence came from. As Russell grew older, he gravitated towards Seattle's nightlife, bars, cocktail lounges, places where people went looking for connection. He wasn't aggressive. He didn't rush. He listened. But rejection cut deeply. When women turned him down, Russell didn't simply walk away. He obsessed. He internalized the slight. At one point, he crossed a line, impersonating a police officer. The incident got him banned from a club, but more importantly, it revealed something dangerous. Russell wasn't just seeking attention. He was testing power. In 1987, he was formally diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, a condition marked by manipulation, lack of empathy, and disregard for the rights of others. By then, the charm wasn't just a personality trait. It was a tool. And by the summer of 1990, George Russell was ready to use it. By the late 1980s, George Russell had learned something important. He didn't need to scare people. He didn't need to threaten them. All he had to do was make them feel safe. Russell blended easily into Seattle's nightlife. He spent his nights in cocktail lounges and bars, places where conversations were casual, lights were low, and defenses were down. He wasn't loud. He wasn't flashy. He listened. Russell asked questions. He nodded at the right moments. He let women talk about themselves. To strangers, he came across as polite, thoughtful, harmless. But that image only worked when he was in control. Rejection was different. When a woman turned him down, Russell didn't brush it off. He didn't laugh it away or move on. He stewed. He replayed it. He internalized it as humiliation. And humiliation to Russell demanded correction. At some point during this period, he crossed a critical line, impersonating a police officer. It wasn't just role play or bravado. It was experimentation. Russell was testing how easily authority could override suspicion, how quickly people complied when they believed someone had power. The incident got him banned from a club, but it didn't stop him. If anything, it reinforced the idea that identity itself could be a weapon. Behind the scenes, Russell's behavior was growing darker. His fantasies became more rigid, more controlling, more violent. In 1987, he was officially diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. The diagnosis explained what those close to him already sensed: a lack of empathy, chronic manipulation, no genuine remorse. But diagnoses don't stop killers. They only describe them. By 1990, Russell wasn't acting on impulse anymore. He was deliberate. He selected women carefully. He waited. He planned. And when he finally crossed from fantasy into action, he didn't hesitate. Because by the summer of 1990, George Russell wasn't just playing a role. The mask was set. The pattern was forming. And his first victim was already dead. The summer of 1990 was warm in the Seattle area. Long daylight hours, busy streets. A season when people stayed out late and paid a little less attention to their surroundings. That's when George Russell struck for the first time. On June 23, 1990, a nude female body was discovered behind a restaurant parking lot in Bellevue. Her name was Mary Ann Polreich. She was 27 years old, a resident of Redmond. She had been strangled. But it wasn't just the killing that immediately stood out to investigators. It was the care. Mary Ann's arms and legs had been crossed neatly, as though she had been placed in a coffin. Her eyes were covered with a plastic lid. This wasn't rage. This wasn't chaos. It was deliberate. The positioning suggested control. Someone who remained after death, arranging the scene to satisfy something personal. Someone who wanted the body found, but found their way. There were no signs of robbery, no indication of a struggle that spilled across the area. Russell hadn't panicked. He hadn't rushed. He had taken his time. At the time, police had little to go on. No witnesses. No immediate suspect. Marianne's murder appeared isolated, tragic, but singular. What investigators didn't yet realize was that they were standing at the beginning of a pattern. The strangulation indicated close contact, hands-on control, a killer who wanted to feel life leaving the body. And the staging suggested something even darker. This wasn't just about death. It was about possession. After the murder, Russell returned to his life as if nothing had happened. He went back to bars, back to conversation, back to charm. No one around him noticed anything unusual, because the most dangerous killers don't change after their first murder. They relax. For weeks, nothing else surfaced. No second body, no clear link. But killers like George Russell don't stop after one. They refine. And by August, he would escalate, bringing his violence into private spaces and leaving behind scenes far more disturbing than the first. He didn't flee. He didn't withdraw. He blended back into the city. For weeks, there were no new bodies, no public panic, no visible signs that a serial predator was moving through Seattle. But silence doesn't mean stopping. It means planning. By August of 1990, Russell had changed his approach. The parking lot was gone. The exposure was gone. This time, he went somewhere private, somewhere controlled. On August 9th, 1990, police were called to a Bellevue apartment. Inside, they found Carol Beatty, 35 years old, dead in her bed. The violence was immediate and overwhelming. Her head had been beaten repeatedly. Bite marks covered her arms. Plastic wrap had been placed over her head. But again, what stopped investigators cold was the staging. Carol's body had been positioned with her legs spread toward the front door. A shotgun had been placed, pointing inward, toward her body. This wasn't symbolic to anyone else. It was symbolic to the killer. Russell wasn't just killing anymore. He was performing. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry, which meant Carol likely knew her attacker, or at least felt comfortable enough to let him inside. That detail narrowed the field. And then came the detail that haunted detectives. Carol's daughter later told police that during the night, she heard someone moving through the apartment with a flashlight, searching rooms, before vanishing. Russell hadn't fled immediately. He had lingered. He explored. He took his time. This was escalation in every sense of the word. The violence was more extreme. The humiliation more intentional. The control more absolute. Investigators now believed they were dealing with a serial offender, someone who was gaining confidence with each murder, someone who wasn't just chasing a high, someone who was refining a ritual. And while police began connecting the dots, Russell was already preparing for his final act, one that would leave no doubt about his intentions. Because by the end of August, the charmer would strike again. And this time, he would leave behind the one mistake he couldn't talk his way out of. By the end of August 1990, George Russell was no longer hiding his intentions. Each crime had grown more violent, more personal, more deliberate. And on August 31st, 1990, he crossed a line he couldn't erase. That morning, police were called to an apartment in Kingsgate, just outside Kirkland. Inside the bedroom, they found Andrea Randy Levine, 24 years old. The scene was brutal. Randy had been stabbed repeatedly. Her skull had been bashed in. This was overkill. Violence far beyond what was necessary to cause death. A release of rage, control, and fantasy all at once. But once again, Russell stayed. After killing her, he staged the body. A sex toy had been shoved down her throat. In her left hand, Russell placed a book, More Joy of Sex. It was mocking, deliberate, a final statement. This wasn't about secrecy anymore. It was about expression. One more detail immediately caught investigators' attention. Randy always wore a distinctive ring, one she rarely, if ever, removed. That ring was gone. The apartment showed no signs of forced entry, reinforcing what police already feared. Randy likely knew the man who killed her. By now, detectives were convinced they were dealing with a serial killer operating in the Seattle area, one who targeted women he could charm into trusting him. But unlike the previous murders, this one left behind a loose thread, and loose threads unravel everything. Within days, investigators would learn that the missing ring hadn't disappeared. It had been given away. And that single act of arrogance would lead police straight to George Russell. By early September of 1990, investigators were no longer searching blindly. 3 women, 3 crime scenes, 1 escalating pattern. The murders of Marianne Polreich, Carol Beathy, and Andrea Levine shared key traits: intimacy, staging, and control. The killer wasn't random, he was methodical. And now he had made a mistake. While investigating Randy Levine's murder, detectives began asking questions about the missing ring. Friends confirmed it was distinctive, something she always wore. Soon, police received a lead. A woman came forward saying she had been given a ring by a man named George Russell. He told her he had bought it from a street vendor in Canada. The story didn't hold. Investigators traced the ring to a pawn shop where it had been sold. The trail was clear. On September 12, 1990, George Waterfield Russell, Jr. was arrested. Once in custody, the evidence began to stack up quickly. Forensic testing linked semen samples found at the crime scenes to Russell. Fibers recovered matched the truck he was driving on the night of Carol Beathy's murder. Each piece alone was damaging. Together, they were devastating. When questioned, Russell denied responsibility for the murders. He maintained his innocence and attempted to explain away the evidence. In telephone interviews, he admitted to owning books about serial killers, including Ted Bundy, but insisted he wasn't a fan. The parallels were impossible to ignore. Like Bundy, Russell relied on charm, on trust, on appearing harmless. But unlike Bundy, Russell didn't have decades to refine his lies. Investigators now had physical evidence, witnesses, and a clear timeline. The mask was cracking. And for the first time since the summer began, George Russell was no longer in control. What remained was the courtroom, where charm means nothing and silence speaks volumes. George Russell entered the courtroom in 1991 the same way he entered bars and apartments: calm, quiet, controlled. There were no outbursts, no visible nerves. As the trial began, prosecutors laid out a case built on pattern, evidence, and intent. They walked the jury through each murder, one by one, showing how the violence escalated and how the staging connected every scene. The forensic evidence was impossible to dismiss. Semen samples linked Russell directly to the victims. Fibers matched the truck he drove. The ring taken from Andrea Levine led investigators straight to him. Witnesses testified about Russell's charm, how safe he seemed, how easy he was to trust. That charm didn't translate in court. Russell pleaded not guilty to all charges. He did not take the stand. Instead, he watched. Families of the victims filled the courtroom. They listened as details of their loved ones' final moments were described in clinical, unflinching terms. Through it all, Russell showed no emotion, no remorse, no reaction. In October 1991, the verdict was read. George Waterfield Russell, Jr. was found guilty of 1 count of first-degree murder, 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. As the words were spoken, Russell remained still. For many in the room, that silence was louder than any confession. The trial had exposed what charm had concealed for years. A man driven by control, entitlement, and cruelty. But the case wasn't over yet, because sentencing would determine whether George Russell ever walked free again, and the court would make sure he didn't. In November of 1991, George Russell returned to court for sentencing. There was no uncertainty about the outcome. The only question was how much of his life would be taken in return. The court reviewed the severity of the crimes. 3 murders marked by sexual violence, degradation, and deliberate staging. These were not crimes of impulse. They were calculated. Russell was sentenced to 2 life sentences, plus 28 additional years. There would be no parole, no second chances. As the sentence was read, Russell showed no visible reaction. No anger, no grief, no acknowledgement of the family sitting only feet away. For the victims' families, the ruling brought a measure of justice, but not closure. Nothing could undo the violence or restore what had been taken. Russell was transferred into Washington State's prison system, where he would spend the rest of his life behind concrete walls and locked doors. Over time, he was moved between facilities, eventually ending up at a high-security corrections center. Outside the prison, life moved on. But the case didn't disappear. Russell's crimes were studied by profilers and criminologists. His behavior, particularly the staging of bodies, became an example of how killers use ritual and symbolism to exert control even after death. His story would later appear in books, documentaries, and true crime series. Not because he deserved attention, but because understanding predators like Russell helps expose the warning signs they leave behind. And those signs matter. Because George Russell wasn't a stranger in the shadows. He was a man people trusted. The case of George Russell didn't end with sentencing. It followed him into books, documentaries, and criminal psychology studies because his crimes represented something investigators fear most: a killer who doesn't look dangerous. Russell became the subject of Jack Olson's 1995 book, Charmer, A Ladies' Man and His Victims, a detailed examination of how charm, manipulation, and entitlement can become lethal when left unchecked. Criminal profilers also studied his behavior closely. In Serial Violence, analysis of modus operandi and signature characteristics of killers, experts pointed to Russell's crime scenes as textbook examples of signature behavior, acts that go beyond killing and reflect psychological needs. The posing, the objects, the symbolism. These weren't random choices. They were expressions of control. Russell's case was later featured in multiple true crime television series, including City Confidential, Secrets of the Morgue, Dead of Night, and Murder by Numbers. In Most Evil, he was ranked 17 out of 22 on their scale, an attempt to quantify something that ultimately can't be measured. What stood out most in every analysis wasn't the brutality alone. It was how ordinary he seemed. Russell didn't stalk dark alleys. He didn't force his way inside. He was invited in. That detail became central to his legacy, used by investigators, advocates, and educators as a warning about trust and situational awareness. Because the most dangerous predators don't rely on fear. They rely on permission. And that realization would shape how this case was remembered long after the headlines faded. George Russell didn't overpower his victims in dark alleys. He was welcomed. He spoke softly. He listened. He made people feel comfortable enough to open a door. That is what makes this case so disturbing. Russell didn't rely on fear. He relied on trust. The women he murdered weren't careless. They weren't reckless. They were human. And that's the part often left unsaid. Cases like this remind us that danger doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always look threatening. Sometimes it looks polite. Sometimes it looks familiar. The legacy of George Russell isn't about his crimes. It's about the warning they leave behind. Pay attention to boundaries. Trust your instincts. And remember that no one is owed access to you. The stories told on UNSAID case files exist to honor victims, not killers. To remember the people whose lives were taken and to recognize patterns that might save someone else. Because the most dangerous predators aren't always the ones who scare us. They're the ones who don't. The cases we cover on UNSAID case files aren't told for shock value. They're told so the victims are remembered and the patterns are seen. Behind every headline is a life that mattered, a voice that was silenced, a warning that often came too late. If this episode stayed with you, help us keep these stories from being forgotten. Follow UNSAID Case Files wherever you listen. Subscribe for future episodes and share this story because awareness is one of the few tools that can still make a difference. Thank you for listening. Stay aware, trust your instincts, and stay safe.